Hey, this is a video for 1.1, Introduction to Ecosystems. So go ahead and check out the overview and set up your guided notes. So before we can talk about an ecosystem, we got to talk about the hierarchy that is involved. To begin with, an ecosystem involves the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors in a particular area. Remember, biotic means living, and abiotic is something that is non-living. In this case, sunlight, water, oxygen, temperature, pH, things of that nature. So we start at the simplest level is an individual of one particular species. A bunch of these individuals together form a population. When we have different populations or different species, we will form a community. And when these communities interact with their abiotic components, that is an ecosystem. We will be discussing biomes and biosphere in upcoming lessons. So we have different types of interactions or biotic interactions. We got to consider interspecific and intraspecific. Interspecific are any interactions between organisms of different species, so between species. And intraspecific is within one single species. One type of interaction is predation, where we have a predator and a prey. And one organism is consuming another consumer for energy. Both the lion and the rabbit in this case are consumers. When we look at a graph showing the relative populations of predator and prey, you'll notice that the prey population is always going to be maybe more variable, and it's always going to peak and drop faster or before the predator population. That is because the prey population, or the prey, is serving as the food for the predator. We'll talk more about this in upcoming lessons. Another type of interaction is herbivory. And herbivory is where one organism consumes a producer for energy. In this case, the rabbit is eating the grass. Another type of interaction is competition. And with competition, two organisms are fighting for the same resources. You've discussed competition in your living environment class. In this case, the plants are competing for living space, nutrients in the soil, sunlight, and water. And whenever you have competition, both organisms are in some way negatively affected. This was shown through a scientist, and this is known as the competitive exclusion principle, which basically means that organisms that are occupying the same niche cannot coexist. A niche is just an organism's role within an ecosystem. This experiment was done using Paramecia, and Paramecium is a single-celled organism, and we have different species. When it was grown by itself, the population of A was relatively higher than the population of B. Now, when they were grown together, both populations actually decreased. So even though A might be better by itself, A and B put together, both of them are going to be negatively impacted. So how do organisms avoid this competition? Well, you've done this with the beaks of finches lab. You might have one bird with a smaller beak, which is able to eat smaller seeds, and if it will average, a small seed. Sometimes they can eat really small seeds. Sometimes they can eat medium-sized seeds. And then you have organisms that will eat larger seeds because they have a larger beak. And there's going to be this little area of overlap. So this will be in time when these finches would be competing. And as I said before, that competition is not always good for both organisms. So these animals or these plants will always try to avoid competition at all costs. So what happens if they do compete, their populations will decrease. So what they do is they perform what is called resource partitioning. And that is a method of avoiding competition between organisms. So because they are partitioning these resources, eventually these populations will differ enough that they will not be competing for the same type of food. There's different ways of avoiding competition. We can do it from morphological strategies, where they have a different shaped beak. They may eat different types of foods, and therefore their body parts are just different. Another example is spatial, so where they are avoiding competition based on the location. Some birds might feed up in the tree, some birds might feed on the ground. Because of these different locations, they are avoiding competition. And finally, we will have temporal. So these birds are avoiding competition based on time. Some birds might feed in the middle of the night, some birds might feed during the day. So now we're going to talk about symbiosis. And the word symbiosis just means together and living. So it's two organisms that have a close relationship, close living relationship. One example is mutualism, and that is where both organisms benefit. Examples of mutualism are lichen, pollinators and flowers, and we also have coral. So lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae, and a coral is a symbiotic relationship between an animal, a coral, and the algae that live within its tissues. And the pollinators will be in a symbiotic relationship with the flowers. So they're all benefiting. And we'll talk more about lichens and corals in future lessons. So commensalism is where one organism is benefited and another is unaffected. You'll see this, you have remoras, you may have different birds that live on like elephants or rhinoceros, if you've ever seen those in documentaries. But these organisms, the larger organism is unaffected, typically, and the smaller organism is getting some protection and getting a source of food. Another example would be nesting birds. And the birds are getting a benefit by having protection from the elements and from predators, and the tree is really unaffected. Another example is parasitism. That's where one organism is benefited and the other organism is harmed. An example would be a mosquito. They're benefiting by getting food, and it is an annoyance or a pain to get mosquito bites. Another example is a strangler fig. This is a type of plant that basically attaches itself to a living plant and then basically kind of strangles the plant, and then eventually the plant on the inside will die and the strangler fig will take over. Another type of symbiotic relationship is amensalism, and that's where one organism is unaffected and the other organism is harmed. An example of this would be penicillin and bacteria. The bacteria are harmed, the penicillin is unaffected. And another example is a black walnut tree. The black walnut trees will secrete specific chemicals in their roots that can harm other plants that are nearby. So it's another way of their avoiding competition. So what I would like you to do is respond to this check for understanding. And now it's time for FRQ practice. What I would like you to do is describe how resource partitioning can alter populations in a forest. I thank you for your attention. I hope that this video was informative. I will see you soon.